Speaking of first 11s, we got the Wellington Phoenix. Both teams had a win and a loss. I think both these games were Newcastle. So 3 out of the 4 games were against Sydney opposition. I'm going to ask you a general question first before we dive into some nitty gritty. 4 games total, 2 games for the men, 2 games for the women, 2 wins, 2 losses. How do you feel about that period for the Wellington Phoenix as a club?
Yeah, I'm not sure because it was a definitely it's the fact they both won in the same week and then they both lost in the same week, and the away one was away to Sydney. Like that's a tricky trip for both of those teams, and I think the women were pretty competitive in their game and just couldn't take their chances. The men also thought played pretty well against Sydney themselves, but just it's kind of a similar story actually, where I think they had chances that they weren't able to take, and they caused them to revert to a bit more of what we saw from them last season, where just the final third is just it's not quite there, it's not quite clicking. It wasn't entirely what we've come to expect from them, but also like they did score an equalizer with 20 odd minutes to go or something, 10 minutes to go, and then conceded 5 minutes later, and then again at the very end, more or less like the 3-1 for the men. There was the third goal is you take risks to chase another goal, and that can happen. 2-1, 3-1, who cares? What's the difference? Especially now that we've found out that goal difference isn't even the deciding factor in the tiebreakers anymore. They've decided without telling anyone in the A-League, decided that it's now based on wins, which means that the Phoenix remain first at the turn of the new year. Not on goal difference, because their goal difference was worse than Melbourne Victory, but they've won 6 games and Melbourne Victory have won 5. Melbourne Victory also undefeated, 5 wins, 5 draws, but apparently that's worse than 6-2 too. So there you go. Doesn't really matter at this stage of the season, but I think there were instances in both of these games, both the Sydney defeats, where you can see the things that worked in the previous wins. I think the men were against Western Sydney and the women was Newcastle. So those games showed things where they've like highlighted the ways in which they've improved, how efficient they've been able to be this season, and just the increased belief and the ability to grind out results. And then you sort of saw a bit of a flip side in the following one. So while the men are first, like that's first with having won 6 of their 10 games, it's not like they're running away with it. And the women, I think, have dipped a little bit to 4th or something along those lines. They actually no, they're 3rd, so that's not so bad. But there's no unbeaten teams remaining there, and Sydney could come soaring through because they have a couple games in hand because they went away to the Asian Champions League stuff. But yeah, it's a little bit of a fortnight that kind of highlights the progress that the teams have made, but also highlights that there's still room to go. And I guess just like good death bowling, consistency is an important thing from week to week. It's one thing to show you're capable of it, but also turning that into results week after week after week. I think the men have been very good with that. I think the women in particular, there might be just a little bit of a thing there with home versus away. Is still trying to figure out the away stuff compared to what they've been able to do at home. But they were back-to-back wooden spooners, so they've improved a lot more than the men have to get where they are. So it's one of those things where we're just kind of in the meat of the season right now, and you're going to get a few roller coaster weeks from time to time. But I think to focus on the positive there, both these teams look really good at home. The men had one little blip with that Newcastle game. That was an off day, and perhaps that was an off day that was coming at some point, and maybe which they needed just to keep things fresh. But other than that, they've been pretty sharp there, and the women especially look really sharp at home. And if you can win those home games and then get the occasional result away, you're going to be a finals team. If you can do it consistently both ways, you're going to be looking at top couple of spots, and both of these teams are in that contention. So they're both in good places. Just that the week on week consistency and keeping those standards at the same level, home and away, and against all levels of opposition is a constant thing, I think, for every team to work on. But that's why they're still working on it.
I didn't see the men's game against Sydney FC, but I do think the nature of how Chiefy is building the squad does not lend itself to consistency. Because if you're throwing in a couple of youngsters every game, you are going to have up and down performances, which is all good because you're probably going to benefit in the long run. And of course, that goes for every other sport. And the more youngsters you have in your team, the less consistent your team is going to be. The women I did see some of their game against Sydney FC, and this goes back to something that I've kind of thought about. I've talked with you about on the podcast. I just haven't thought about it this way, where it felt like I was watching a bit of tennis against Sydney FC.
Yeah, I can see that.
Everything the Wellington Phoenix women are trying to do, there's a lot of razzle-dazzle. The small ball is all about intricate passing, putting the ball into space, kind of quick decisions, quick moves, incisive moves. McMeekin wasn't starting against Sydney FC, right?
No, I think she came off the bench.
Yeah, so that's we talked about McMeekin a fair bit, and not having her in the left back position did decrease the funk of that Wellington Phoenix woman. But I'm kind of glad she wasn't playing, because the Wellington Phoenix woman, they were turning the ball over with their kind of first funky movement, their first little bit of razzle-dazzle. When they got the ball, they'd lose the ball, and then suddenly Sydney FC have the ball. But then the Wellington Phoenix women, they've got good defense to cover a lot of their mistakes. So then they get the ball back, they make a pass, razzle-dazzle movement, turns the ball over. So you're kind of going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's where the tennis idea comes, because your head's just going across the screen, and it does get a bit hectic to watch, because you're like, okay, how about we just hold the ball for 5 passes and just make the easiest pass possible just to keep hold of the ball? I think they can do that, but they do it with a high degree of difficulty. And that high degree of difficulty does create a lot of turnovers. And the way they want to move the ball, the way they want to put the ball into space, it is a lot of razzle-dazzle. There's a lot of turns, there's a lot of funky touches, passes that if they come off, they look great. If they don't come off, they've gone straight to the opponent who is attacking. So it can be a bit hectic watching the Wellington Phoenix women roll through their style of football. And I think they have a far clearer style of football compared to the men. I think the men are a bit more adaptable. They've got a few different tools for different situations. They can play football a few different ways, where I think the Wellington Phoenix women have a clear style of football that you can watch opposition teams trying to deal with it. They know what's coming, but they still need to be able to. It's like the Macy Fraser shimmy.
Yeah,
you know it's coming. And I think against might have been Newcastle, they had a set piece. It was a corner, and it goes to Macy Fraser, and she does 2 shimmies before she gets a shot off. One shimmy to create space, another shimmy to create space. Now she's in the middle of the field, bang, shot. It's well, everyone knows her move, and they literally had a set piece designed to use her move. And everyone, and the defenders, bit on the move twice. So it's it's coming, but you haven't been in that position before, so you don't necessarily know how to stop it. I think that is a microcosm of what the Wellington Phoenix women are doing as a team, where you can observe the opposition processing all the short passing, all the razzle-dazzle. And a lot of these women's A-League teams, they're quite gritty. There's a lot of Aussie athletes in those teams who just love to rip in, lots of fouls, lots of movement, hard yakka to get into space. So you can kind of watch them. They're real physical, but then they're a bit timid. But then later on in the game, they know what's coming, so they can up the ante. Don't know what my ultimate point here was, but I did feel like watching that Sydney FC game, it was a bit tennisy. So it was like the downside of their style was evident, but then their style was also effective because they were in the contest for a long time away from home, which you said is more difficult for them.
Yeah, and against the defending champs as well, who admittedly have lost a few players, as always happens in the A-League. You win the A-League, you're going to lose some players to overseas, but it's still Sydney FC. They got a big production pool, and it was one of their youngest players came off the bench and scored the winner. So, like that, but at the same time, though, you can argue that the Phoenix women were the better team, and they had more possession. They had fewer shots, but the shot tallies are weird because I'm looking at the thing here. Sydney had 21 of them overall compared to 12 for the Phoenix, but the Phoenix had 7 on target, and Sydney only had 3 on target. Phoenix made 12, blocked 12 different shots, and good sign of a strong back four there, where they're just able to anticipate the shot, get in the way, don't fall for the Macy Fraser shimmy every time, and allow the clean shot get in the way. So yeah, they allowed a lot of opportunities, but they also then defended those opportunities and didn't really. It felt like a game that probably should have been 0-0. I mean, Speckmeyer missed a golden opportunity with a header. Sydney then scores an even better header, a tougher situation, but a better executed header. And then it's 1-0 to Sydney in a game which honestly could have gone 1-0 either way, could have been a 0 draw. Any of those outcomes would have been acceptable because it was a tough, gritty, especially defensively, performance. And I don't know. That's the lesson you got to learn, though, isn't it? Is how to turn those into results and not lose a game where you in position to win it. You're not going to be able to win that every time, but can you at least get out of there with the 0 draw rather than the 1-0 loss kind of thing? That's just something to figure out with the blokes. I guess the key point, because it talks sort of about the kind of club perspective, just specifically now on the individual teams. With the blokes, it was like, I should mention as well, like a reputation enhancing performance from Ben Old, who was unreal in that game, where he was, I mean, there's still things you can see with him. Like, he wasn't necessarily completing a lot of chances, but the thing he did so well at National League level for the reserves was just he's really quick on the turn, and he's got great close control, and he's deceptively strong. Like, he's got the way he receives the ball, he's got a low center of gravity. He can withstand that first nudge from a defender, and he also knows how to use his body really well. So he's the guy who just is, ever since he debuted in the A-League, consistently one of the most fouled players. Like, he just always is winning free kicks. And you saw against Sydney the way he would playing him in the midfield. I think is a bit of a masterstroke from Chiefy. I think that's the spot where he's going to have the best impact, because his final product is still a little bit sketchy, like a few of the other guys in that team. This is the point I was making about them, is it's not from season to season, it's not like they've become better finishers. It's just that they're putting themselves in better positions to finish. They're creating better, more open chances so that their sketchy finishing isn't so much of an issue. And Old was like dropping way back in the midfield, picking the ball up, guy rushes him, he turns past him, space to charge into. He just did that over and over again. It was fantastic. But they couldn't put their chances away. He was a little bit part of that. I think Costa had a couple of misses. David Ball just wasn't doing the stuff you might necessarily hope in that attacking third as well. And Kraev too, you'd have to say. And then ultimately, when that's the case, it's just a stark reminder that they were playing without Oscar Zavada again. And while Oscar Zavada is out, I think the blokes kind of just, they're going to, unfortunately, just going to have some games like that where just it feels like there's just this glaring thing of who's going to put the ball in the back of the net. Because if they had that in that game, it might have gone the other way. That could have been a different story. But when you don't, you don't. And that's just where they're at the moment, is their top scorer and the guy they do rely on to do a lot of work for them up front. Holding the ball up and laying it off as much as he does scoring as well. He's excellent at both of those things. But they didn't have him. And without him, you can see an Oscar Zavada shaped hole up front. Whereas the Phoenix women, it was like that's their top team. They're there. It was a good solid performance, and then maybe just a few like learning curves that they're still working on. With the blokes, it was not so much that as it was like the issue was that their best striker wasn't there, and then when he's not there, it's they're not going to be quite as good, and that's going to lead to results like this. But you can also see how easily he fits into that team, and when he does come back, that's where things get dangerous.
I also thought the goalie for the women was quite good, Brianna Edwards. I think
Yeah,
she
filling
is.
in for Riley Foster, the Canadian who was out with a concussion.
I
And
think
Edwards, second time, Edwards has done well in both games.
I think she could be the starter, easy. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily see much of a difference between her and Foster. Ben Old, best player for the men over this 2 week stretch. Who's the best player for the women over the 2 week stretch?
Oof. I don't know. I have to think about that. I don't know if I would split them, but I've really liked the combination since it's become a thing as centre back of Mackenzie Barry and Rebecca Lake. I think they've been able to fill in without Marissa Vandermeer pretty smoothly there. As far as that goes, season ender to a starter, Lake comes in, no dramas. And Barry also like responsible for a lot of those blocks in that game. She's very good.